Okay, hope everyone's doing well. Um, so we're going to basically keep focusing on the First World War on the Eastern Front, but basically we're going to be concentrating on one of the most interesting developments of World War I on the Eastern Front. That's the Russian Revolution, and some of the really interesting figures who play a major role in this revolution, including a really bizarre figure by the name of Rasputin. Rasputin really wasn't his name. Rasputin is a description in Russian of who he was, but we'll get to that later on. So World War I was really quite a devastating event in all the different ways we spoke about, the number of dead and injured and astronomical, 10 million or so. And then because of the impact of the war and the lack of fuel and lack of proper nutrition and so on, that was the last pandemic 100 years ago. The Spanish flu came right out of World War I, and that meant another 5 million people who died. So in terms of the loss of life and injury and maiming and psychological illness, devastating. And then you remember it was also the end of all those empires that existed forever. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, well, it's a newer empire, the German one, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all gone. But one of the most devastating events was with respect to Russia and the end of the 300-year-old dynasty of the Romanov family. The czars who ruled, the autocrats, the brutal rulers of Russia for 300 years. And then, as you'll see, World War I brought not only an end to the Russian Empire and ultimately to the assassination of the royal family of the Romanovs, but also the ascent of a new form of government, that is communism. And communism made its appearance in 1917 in Russia as a direct result of World War I. By the end of World War II, communism, was the system in most all of Eastern Europe and a couple of places overseas, like Cuba and other communist countries, China, and so on. So communism comes out of the First World War, and obviously its spread was quite impressive in the years that followed. So again, for political reasons and historical reasons, what happened to Russia as a result of the ill-fated Russian war effort in World War I was the rise of communism. Part of the cause of the regime change in Russia was a consequence of the poor military planning. Remember, the Russians suffered some horrific defeats in the beginning of the war on the Eastern Front. First, the famous Battle of Tannenberg, where the German army devastated the Russian army, led to the suicide of one of the Russian generals, Samsonov. And then there was the following battles that took place in the Masurian Lakes, the lake region of Russia, which is bounded on one side by the only primeval forest in Europe. And because of the geographic setup, that made it very difficult for the Russian army, which had to split into two. That led to the encirclement of both Russian armies by the Germans and the Austrians. And so the Masurian Lakes battles, together with the Battle of Tannenberg, made it clear the Russians were headed for disaster. They had a few victories along the way, Brusilov's offensive and so on, but basically the Russian army was ill prepared for any kind of a conflict. Remember, they had inadequate armaments. A lot of these soldiers were marching to the front. They didn't have rifles. They had poor communications. They had insufficient rail lines. They were so vulnerable in terms of communications. The Germans could actually read and encode and encrypt their different messages, military messages, so the Germans knew exactly what their plans were. All in all, not a great situation. And then add to that the huge expanse of a huge country, right? Moving troops, very difficult. And then on top of that, and this is really an important aspect, the Russian soldiers had no loyalty to Mother Russia. They lived miserable lives. This was a brutal autocracy, the Russian Tsarist regime. The Tsar lived very nicely. The aristocracy, the aristocrats, mostly in the large cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and so on, they lived very nice lives too. And everyone else, if they weren't barely eking by and starving, it was worse. They were indentured servants. It was still a serfdom for the most part, where peasants were bound to the land and forced to work and barely fed and clothed. So not exactly a situation where people are going to enthusiastically embrace a war effort, for whom, for what? To go back to the miserable life that you had to begin with, put it all together and did not bode well for Russian success. And then there was this other issue. I'm going to talk more about that, and I'm going to show you a documentary at the end. And this is a really interesting story. We'll talk more about this guy specifically later on, but a figure appeared in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was then the capital of Russia, the imperial capital. Later on, it became Leningrad. And now it's, once again, since the fall of communism, it's St. Petersburg again. But that was the site of the Russian imperial capital. And a figure emerged there by the name of Rasputin. That really wasn't his name. He was called Rasputin because in his youth, he was a real degenerate individual, a real immoral, to say the least, figure. And that's what Rasputin means in Russian. It means a degenerate figure. He was a womanizer and a sexual pervert and a thief and so on. But then he underwent a religious conversion. He was about 18 years old. And pretty soon he became some sort of a mystical religious leader. And he actually became the advisor, amazingly, to the Tsarina. Here she is. The Tsarina is Alexandra II, who was the empress. Tsarina is the empress of Russia. And I mentioned, I think, earlier on, she was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. In those days, royal families intermarried. So 3 of the main figures in the World War I era were actually first cousins. Alexandra I was married to Nicholas II. Nicholas II, the ruler of Russia during World War I. He, by virtue of his marriage to Alexandra, he became a cousin to the King of England and the Emperor of Germany, because the King of England, George, was a grandson of Queen Victoria, and Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, was a grandson of Queen Victoria through his mother, and Nicholas II was married to the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So they were all connected, and that led, interestingly, to the situation that propelled this guy Rasputin to become the important figure he was. We'll get to that shortly. So, as it turns out, to the chagrin of most of the officials in Russia and most of the ministers, this guy Rasputin, here he is, you can see just by looking at his face, a frightening and evil guy. By the way, he was like 6'8" also. It was a huge presence, so quite frightening. But what actually brought him to prominence was that the Tsarevich, I think I have a picture of him, maybe I do. It was the son of the Tsar and the Tsarina. Do I have a picture? No. And he suffered from hemophilia. And hemophilia was a disease that affected the clotting factor in the blood. In other words, if you suffer from hemophilia, you and if you were injured and the bleeding didn't stop, and you just bled to death. Hemophilia was an affliction that seemed to be quite prevalent amongst the ruling families, probably because they married each other. And while it might have been a recessive gene, enough of those intermarriages, it suddenly becomes a dominant gene. And unfortunately, the young Tsarevich, the heir to the throne and the only son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, they had a few daughters, but he was the only son. So he was, the crown prince. He was the guy who's going to take over. Obviously very much concerned about his health and well-being. And so he was guarded, you can't imagine, every move he took, there were all sorts of individuals that were on the payroll of the court to make sure he didn't stumble or fall or get injured. And his mother, the Tsarina, Alexandra, was quite concerned about the well-being of her son, and she was not the most stable human being to begin with. And somehow or other, Rasputin convinced her that he had great healing powers, and he did, for some inexplicable reason, manage, maybe it was coincidence, but he managed actually to save the Tsarevich a few times and so suddenly he became the most important figure and confidant in the court, in part because Nicholas II, for all of his power, and he was a powerful emperor and a brutal emperor, I mean, an incredible autocrat, but as is often the case, notwithstanding his power and his influence and his brutal reputation, his wife ran the show. Right? Happens. And so the fact that the Tsarina, Alexandra, was so enamored of Rasputin and so under his power and spell, she allowed him really to make most of the decisions. We'll see exactly how that came about. It's sort of a complicated story. But in any case, this guy Rasputin, in fact, was probably the one most significant in terms of how the war progressed for the Russians. By the way, Rasputin had an interest in making sure that the empire remained. I mean, he was obviously dependent upon the Romanovs remaining in power so that he would remain in power. And the truth is, in the beginning, he cautioned the Tsar not to get involved in the war. He told him it's not going to be a good situation. It's not going to have a happy ending. But notwithstanding Rasputin's actually prophetic advice, the Tsar went along anyway in calling up the Russian army and getting ready to wage war against Austria and Germany. So this guy Rasputin, who the Tsarina referred to as our friend, right, was really the guiding force between the catastrophe that ended up being the Russian war on the Eastern Front. And anyone in the government who had the audacity to question the decision-making of Rasputin was up the creek. He was finished. You were fired. Because ultimately the Tsar himself sort of went along with his wife and allowed Rasputin all of this power and influence and decision-making. What happened was the Tsar's uncle, briefly, I mentioned this the last time, was in charge of the war effort. But as things turned south and the war was not going well, he was bounced. And the Tsar took over. And he had no military experience. He had no understanding of military strategy. And so things only got worse. On top of that, he planted himself on the front to be near the action. And his wife Alexandra, the Tsarina, was back home in the capital calling the shots. And her chosen advisor, Rasputin, was really the one who made the decisions. She just mouthed his words, basically. All in all, not a good situation. Now, the figure of Rasputin was, he was despised by the government officials. And the citizens of Russia, as things got worse and they suffered more and more, they developed a hatred for Rasputin because they figured he's the guy responsible for all of their suffering. Now, Rasputin had, amongst other unfortunate reputations, he was, to say the least, an incredible womanizer. Not only was an incredible womanizer, but he, as part of his religious belief system, this is incredible, but he believed that the way to have the greatest communion with God, to have the greatest spiritual fervor, is to be totally exhausted from sexual activity. So he was not only a womanizer, but he went to excessive sexual encounters to reach this spiritual level he spoke about. And as the people of Russia became more disgusted with him and angered by their situation, the rumor broke out that in fact he was having an affair with the Tsarina, which may or may not have been true, but that was the rumor out there. And but his power over women was phenomenal. And if you look at this guy, you've got to wonder why. You know, not exactly Robert Redford, but whatever, you know, no accounting for tastes and colors. I don't know. So, anyway, and in fact, he, like I said, he was known in the government circles amongst the ministers who hated him as the mad monk. But amongst the others, he was this great mystical spiritual leader. And he even convinced everyone that mere contact with his body produced spiritual benefits and so on and so forth. So he's really the guy, and we'll talk more about him in detail. He was the guy really behind what was going on during this devastating period of World War I in Russia. The Russian government was already kind of shaky because you might recall, I mentioned the Russians engaged in the war in 1905. That war was against the Empire of Japan. Now, Japan in 1905 was a feudal, backward, medieval empire, very weak, very far removed from modern technology and modern thought. So theoretically, it should have been a slam dunk for the Russians. But for a number of reasons, the Russians lost the war. It's 1905. When the Russians lost the war in 1905, there was already a strong reaction. Like I said, the Russian population, for the most part, I mean, the largest percentage were starving, miserably underfed and underclothed, you know, illiterate peasants. So there was an attempt at a revolution in 1905. It failed, but in order to make people happy, the Tsar at the time said, okay, I'm going to institute certain reforms and will become more democratic. There'll be more input from the people, and the parliament, which is known as the Duma, D-U-M-A, the parliament will have more power also. But that was a farce. None of that happened. No one gained any more power, but the revolution failed. But that revolutionary spirit was in the air, and 9 or 10 years later, when World War I is now raging, the situation is the same. The Russians are still starving. They're still enslaved. They have no rights. Certain minorities suffered miserably. Jews suffered miserably under the Russian regime. constantly being attacked by government pogroms. And the Jewish population of Russia at the time was probably the largest in Europe. But they were forced to live in a pale of settlement, a very restricted area. They had absolutely no rights, no possibility for advancement. It was miserable, but that was one group. Overall, though, the situation in Russia was horrible. So the Duma, the UMA, the parliament, had very little power. But as the war progressed, World War I progressed, and things got worse, there was an outcry from certain segments of the population to the parliament, to the Duma, basically asking for the removal of the Tsar. And so members of the parliament met with the Tsar, this is September of 1915, in his military headquarters, which was far removed from the capital, and told him he was losing the confidence of the people. And there are two things that make a dictatorship possible. One is it's always good to have the confidence of the people and their support. But lacking that, the most important thing is to have the army behind you. Every good dictatorship, every stable dictatorship has the favor of the army, right? And because that's how you stay in power. That's not what happened in Russia, as you'll see. But the parliamentary members told the Tsar, you're walking on thin ice. This is not a good situation, and people want, they want change, and they're not happy with the situation. But the Tsar wouldn't go along. In fact, he wouldn't even meet with these representatives. He had no interest in what the people wanted or what they were lacking or anything else. The Tsar, besides being an incredibly ignorant guy and totally henpecked by his wife, lived in his own world. You might have, maybe you saw the movie Dr. Zhivago, great movie, quite old now, but it portrays very well how the Russian emperor lived. You might have heard stories about the famous Winter Palace. So Russia's a brutal place in the winter. To say it's cold is an understatement. And but if you're the Tsar, that's no problem. They built it was known as the Winter Palace for the Tsar. What was it? It was a huge, huge palace that was enclosed by a glass periphery, and inside, where the temperature was maintained at a very high level of summer heat, they brought in all kinds of tropical plants and animals and birds and everything else. And so even though everyone was starving and freezing and miserable out there in the Russian countryside, the Tsar was inside his winter palace where it was basically the tropics. So he was totally separated and isolated from the reality of his people and their lives and even the country he ruled. In the summer, it was nice and hot in Russia. And then he would go off to the summer residence where he would, actually was, if you remember from that documentary we saw on the dynasties, he would spend the summers playing all sorts of sports and whatever with his children out in the country estate. So his life was separate and apart from his people, and he had no interest, frankly, in the lives of his subjects. Obviously, that being the case, he wasn't about to listen to their complaints as they expressed them to the parliament, and the parliament sought to have a meeting with him. Fact is also that by September of 1915, Rasputin took over full control of government decision-making and of the conduct of the war, and so on and so forth. By that time, there was also a serious food problem. People were starving. There was an incredible shortage even of bread, the staple of life. And when the revolution broke out, the people standing there, the tens of thousands with signs saying, "We want bread, we want bread." They weren't interested in the military victories or anything. They wanted to be able to feed their family. So now with the Tsar away from the city, away from the capital, out there on the field, taking over military command, his wife making decisions under the influence of Rasputin, obviously things became more and more intolerable, and the situation only worsened. The way that these countries dealt with these unpleasant situations was to call various strikes. Different segments of the society responded by saying, look, we're not going to provide services anymore. So the first thing was there was a rail strike, rail workers struck. And this was in 1916, in October of 1916. And without railways, you know, we mentioned earlier on how the rail system in Germany enabled them to carry on the war to a great extent. The Russians didn't have that great a system to begin with, but now the rail workers said, we're not putting up with this anymore. We're striking, no more rail service. The Duma, the parliament, became very alarmed at the situation as it deteriorated in the city, in the capital and so on, and had no idea what to do in light of these shutdowns. It only began with the rail workers. It spread to other workers as time went on. Pretty soon you shut down the entire country, its economy, its infrastructure, and everything else. In 1916, it's November of 1916, the leader of the progressive group in the parliament began an attack on the government. And so he was pushed away. A more reactionary leader was put in his place. Then a guy by the name of Sturmer, S-T-U-R-M-E-R, became the major minister in the government. And he just started firing everybody or arresting them if they expressed any opposition to what the government was doing. He was basically a rubber stamp for the Tsarina and for her friend, Rasputin. In the meantime, Tsar Nicholas is isolated on the front, and he was an incredibly indecisive human being, could never make a decision about anything. So his wife is back home dominating the home front, and he's stuck on the battlefront, but incapable of making any kind of a definitive move, either militarily or in response to what's going on with the unrest in the cities. So finally, the people in Petrograd, this is St. Petersburg, capital, they were cold, they were hungry, and they were disgusted. Not a good situation for the emperor and for the regime. I mean, when people put up with a lot, but when they haven't got food, they can't feed their children, and they're dying left and right from all sorts of disease as a result of insufficient fuel to heat their homes and so on. Things are going to go off in an unpleasant and dangerous direction. In the meantime, one of the government officials, a guy by the name of Prince Yosipov, who was an aristocrat, decided enough is enough. This guy Rasputin is totally out of control. The country is collapsing, and got to get rid of him. And ultimately, he managed to assassinate Rasputin. This was in December of 1916. But just to show you how formidable a guy Rasputin was, they had to get rid of the guy, right? Now, he was a big party animal, Rasputin, and all the women, the upper classes in Russia were totally infatuated with him. And he was, always being invited to the most elegant and sumptuous gatherings and soirees and so on. So Yusupov decided what we're going to do is throw this big party, and we're going to serve Rasputin cake and wine, but of course it's all poison, poisoned everything. So they're serving him the stuff, and he's drinking away, bottle after bottle of wine, poison, right? The guy doesn't die. He refused to die. I mean, anyone else would have been gone in a second. This guy is pouring it in, and the poison just isn't killing him. So then they said, okay, this isn't working. So another assassin came by with a gun, and they shot him. Didn't die either, right? He's still moving around, even though he's been shot. Finally, after a number of bullets enter his body, he's sort of near death, but they're so convinced that the guy is just immortal. That they took his body and dumped it in a river in town, which at the time was freezing. They had to dig a hole, a round hole, to dump his body through the ice. And they say once and for all, he didn't die so fast either, but ultimately he drowned. And a while later in the spring, they found his body on the shore when the ice melted and the waters become unfrozen and so on. But they couldn't even kill him. But by then, it was basically too late to salvage the situation. And there were riots in the streets, and things were totally out of control. So the Grand Duke, Paul, who's the brother of the Tsar, decided that he's got to call in the army. That's the only way to maintain order. They called in the police. The police couldn't, not only the police couldn't stop the crowds and carrying on the rioting, some of the police were sympathetic to the crowds, so they didn't really try. So they had to call in the army. What happened when they called in the army to quell the rioters and to stop this whole, outbreak? The army turned against the Tsar, and instead of firing on the rioters and the protesters and everything else, they joined them. Like I said, you can't last long as a despot, as a dictator, as a brutal ruler when you haven't got the army behind you. And the army turned on the Tsar, and basically that was it for him. What happened was that he and his family, the Tsar, he had this one son, and he had a few daughters. We have 4 daughters, 5 daughters. All of them, including the Tsarina, were shipped off to a place called Ekaterinburg, and they were placed in a building, and they were all summarily shot to death. And that was the end of the Romanov dynasty and the reign of the Tsar and the brutal dictatorship of the Romanovs. But then what? What was it replaced by? It was replaced by a communist government, not so fast. There's a guy by the name of Kerensky. Find a picture of him. I think this is him. Alexander Kerensky, interesting figure. He was a lawyer and parliamentarian, and he took over with a provisional government. You'll hear all these details in the documentary you can hear shortly. But his government didn't last long either, because waiting in the wings was a guy who had been planning the ultimate takeover and transformation of Russia, a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin. There he is on the screen. And Lenin, who was in exile, living in Switzerland, managed to find his way back to Russia. Very interesting story. He was in Switzerland, and things are going awry in Russia. And this is his moment, right? He's the communist ideologue. He's the one who has been plotting the overthrow and everything else. But how's he going to get from one place to another? The German government, it's amazing. The German government actually is responsible for getting Lenin from Switzerland to Russia in a sealed train. Why would they want to deliver him to Russia? This is World War I. It's exactly what the Germans wanted. They figured to get Lenin back into Russia, he will really foment the ultimate revolution, and the Russians will be out of the war. And then it's not a 2-front war anymore. Then it's a 1-front war, which the war is still going on the Western Front. And the 2-front war is basically what ruined everything for the Germans. They figured they'd get Lenin back to Russia, and that will be the end of Russia's participation in World War I. Indeed, that's what happened. You'll see in the documentary. But the irony is, when the war ended, when World War I ended, Russia is now a communist country. Interestingly, this isn't, I don't really talk about much But what happened to Germany at the end of World War I? We all know about Russia, now, big communist country now. Well, when World War I ended in Germany and the Germans lost, people weren't so happy either. And when people are unhappy, especially after spending 4 years of losing incredible numbers of their sons and husbands and so on in a fruitless war, then they had to deal with all the economic hardship and the lack of food and the lack of fuel, just like in Russia. People weren't happy when it was all over with. And one of the responses in Germany when the war ended was to consider, you know what, this government of ours and this whole structure, you know, what has it done for us? They lied to us. We lost. It was brutal. We want a regime change too. Well, you know what happened in Germany? There were a number of attempts at a communist revolution there. And in fact, in Kiel, which is a port city in the northern part of Germany, on the North Sea, you might remember from one of the early documentaries that during that arms race leading up to World War I and the German desire to surpass the British Navy, they expanded the size of the port in Kiel to accommodate battleships and so on. Well, at the end of the war is almost over, it's clearly lost. The German government was still sending soldiers and sailors to try and continue the battle. The sailors in Kiel decided, nah, no way. We're not going to be human fodder, you know, cannon fodder. So they set up what known as Soviets. Soviet is a Russian word for workers' council. That's why back in the day, before the collapse of communism in Russia, it was known as the Soviet Union. It's a collection of workers' councils. And in Kiel, the soldiers not only defied, and the sailors not only defied the government, they set up their own communist councils, Soviet councils, to try and take over. In Bavaria, in Germany, in the capital city of Munich, capital of Bavaria, one of the provinces, there was actually a communist revolution. And for a brief time, there was a communist government in Bavaria. There was an attempt in Berlin to take over the government and form a communist government there. Two leaders of the Spartacus communist movement, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, actually stormed the palace. And in fact, Liebknecht spent a few nights in the palace of the former Kaiser, the former emperor, before he was hauled out, and he and Rosa Luxemburg were assassinated and dumped into a canal in Berlin, and that was the end of that revolution. But communism was a threat in Germany at the end of World War I as well, because of the dissatisfaction with the outcome of the war. Ironically, Hitler and the Nazis, part of their platform and their propaganda was the instilling the fear of communism taking over in Germany, just like it did in Russia. Ironically, it's the Germans who placed Lenin back in Russia to lead this revolution, as you'll see. And a lot of ironies. But this revolution, of course, changed the face of Russia, ended the Romanov dynasty, and everything that followed. One other interesting side point, I think it's going to come up in the documentary in case it doesn't. One of the figures in this Russian Revolution who was also living in exile, first he was living in exile in Mexico, also came back to try and be a part of this overthrow and revolution. His name is Leon Trotsky. It's interesting, I think, to Guys and Lenin is before he went back to Russia, Trotsky was living in exile on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And his one son was actually attending public school in the Bronx before he packed his bags with his wife and they went back to partake in the revolution. So World War I, to summarize, was really a major watershed, I should say, in the history of Russia and its turn to communism. There are some interesting stories that go along with it. We haven't got time, but there was an attempt by the United States early right after World War I ended, or towards the end of World War I, with the United States, it was known as the Polar Bear Expedition. The United States actually did send troops to Russia to try and undermine the revolution, counter-revolutionary troops to try and undo the communist regime in Russia. It failed miserably, and that is what led to the intense hatred between the United States and Russia for all those years that followed, in good part because the Russians never trusted the United States after they tried to intervene and destroy their new government. A few more points about Rasputin, and then we'll see the documentary, Revolution in Red. His real name was Gregory Yefimovich, but he was given the name Rasputin. He was born in 1872, died in 1916. As I said, he was assassinated. He was born in Siberia. His father was basically a peasant. And he and the family totally illiterate. It's not clear whether he ever learned to read or write, Rasputin. But he lived this very degenerate life. Like I said, his name, Rasputin, means the debauched one. He was a lowlife. But then he discovered religion. As I said, he was about 18, and he became involved with a certain sect and started preaching. And then part of his religious doctrine was this extreme sexual engagements, which led to a certain exhaustion, which he believed led to a connection with God and so on. At the age of 19, he married. Interestingly, the name of his wife, I have to check someday, his wife's name was Praskovia Fyodorovna. A typical Russian name, but what's interesting is that I teach Comp Lit at Baruch, and one of the things we read is a novella by Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy, called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And the wife of the main character in that story, Ivan Ilyich, her name is also Praskovia Fyodorovna. I wonder whether he intentionally chose that name and there's some connection to Rasputin. I don't know. Interesting. Anyway, he married at 19 and they had 4 children, but then he left his wife and started traveling. He was in Greece and then he was in Jerusalem. And he established a reputation there as a holy man and a mystic and so on. Then he ended up in St. Petersburg in 1903. He met up with a certain bishop, Saratov, who then introduced him to the royal family, the Romanovs. That's how he connected to the Tsarina. Rasputin tried to maintain this image of a humble, mystical guy, nothing of great importance, even though he had this voracious sexual appetite. He was a womanizer and so on and so forth. But he developed this relationship with the Tsarina, was very vulnerable, worried about her son. And when news got out that the Tsarevich, the son, his name was Alexis, was serious and so on, he was called Rasputin. He gave them certain advice, whatever seemed to have cleared up the situation. People suggest he used hypnosis, possibly, to stop the bleeding, whatever. In any case, it worked. And that's what allowed him to become so close to the Tsarina, to Alexandra, and then basically take over the whole show and basically the whole conduct of the war. He made the decisions and she went along with it, and her husband apparently had no choice. He was the henpecked husband, whatever. He had many government officials removed when they disagreed with him. He did it through the Tsarina. No one was allowed to question his word or his decision-making or anything else. There was even a theory that there was some sort of conspiracy between Rasputin and Alexandra with the German government, because remember, she was of German origin originally. I mean, her grandmother was British, but her mother was German. She was German aristocracy and nobility. So when the Russians started losing one battle after another, they said, you know, maybe they're in cahoots with Germans, and that's why things are going south. There are all kinds of issues that were floating around. And obviously, the figure of Rasputin, as I said, became one totally detested, not only by the government, but ultimately by the population as well. And ultimately, he was assassinated in 1916. But in 1917, with all of this going on and the unfortunate situation with the war effort, finally the attempted revolution took place. The one that failed in 1905 succeeded in 1917, and I'm going to show you a documentary on that revolution and its connection to World War I. Are there any questions about what we've discussed so far? If you missed anything.
Yeah. Oh.
Yes?
I was gonna ask us on the midterm, is all the videos that we are
you know what? There's going to be a few minutes left after this this documentary, and then I'm going to discuss the midterm.
Okay.
This is the unknown war, the Eastern Front in 1915, where the Russian army sits in ponderous disarray. It is an awkward colossus, bigger than any army in history, but its punch is all manpower and horsepower. It has no adequate railroads or highways to move its millions of men. 2/3 of its peasant soldiers cannot read or write. Deeply loyal to their Orthodox Church, they are brave and stubborn in attack, quick to panic in defeat. Efficient in artillery, in shells, even in cartridges, they fight mostly with bayonets. Sometimes they do not even have rifles, but they attack anyway, tearing with bleeding hands at barbed wire. Responding to Allied appeals, the Russians divert German strength from the Western Front. But soon they are driven back in defeat. An estimated 9 million Russians will fall or surrender during the first 3 years of the war. The disillusionment and despair spelled doom to the Tsarist regime. There will be only one winner, a revolution with a blood-red flag, a revolution that will shake the world for decades to come. Commander-in-Chief of the Tsar's armies is a stern professional soldier, a giant of a man, 6'6", the Tsar's uncle, Grand Duke Nicholas, ablest member of the Romanov family. Forced to strike before his armies are fully mobilized, forced by France's desperate call for help, he has suffered terrible defeats at Tannenberg, Masurian Lake, and Warsaw. Behind him as Minister of War is a corrupt politician in uniform named Vladimir Sokolnikov, who amasses a fortune by selling munitions contracts, and will finally be imprisoned, charged with being a German agent. Russia's most conspicuous failure is the man who should be its strength, Tsar Nicholas II, a moody, henpecked husband at home, a vacillating autocrat to his subjects. Late in 1915, the Tsar brushes his uncle aside and takes command of the Russian armies into his own incompetent hands. The Eastern Front in 1916 is a map of humiliation for Russia. Most of Poland is lost. Early gains in Austria are all but wiped out. But once again, the Allies are calling for help. Again, Russia will go on the offensive to relieve pressure on Verdun and Italy. In charge at the southern end of the front is Russia's best general, Alexei Brusilov, a fiery old-line cavalry officer. He sends his horsemen out to tap the enemy lines in the Austrian province of Galicia to find out, he says, what is solid stone and what is lath and plaster. He has been hoarding precious shells for months. Now he will use them up in a single day of furious bombardment, then push his army forward. Prodded by Brusilov's Cossacks, the lath and plaster wall collapses, and the Russians pour through two broad gaps. The attack continues fiercely all summer, practically eliminates Austria as a military power, and encourages nearby Romania to join the Allies, with the hope of picking up some cheap spoils. More than 400,000 prisoners are taken, many of them pro-Russian Slavs who readily desert the Austrian army. German units are thrown in to stiffen the Austrian defense, under two distinguished field marshals, Mackensen and Falkenhayn. They rout the Romanians, force Brusilov to extend his lines to cover the gap. In October, Brusilov's offensive bogs down for lack of reinforcements and supplies. At the price of almost 1 million casualties, it has given Imperial Russia its final moment of military glory. A 60-mile advance into the vast landscape of Eastern Europe. On the flanks of Brusilov's salient, other Russian armies are disintegrating or pulling away in retreat, dismantling their communications lines as they go. And everywhere among Russian soldiers, there spreads a sullen conviction that they have been misled and betrayed. A short while ago, they feared their officers. Now, their officers fear them. Even Brusilov is ready for revolt. He accuses the royal family of ruining Russia. The army is turning its back on the war. The path of Russian retreat is cluttered with refugees. In flight from hunger, exhaustion, fear, they will find the same things in the towns and cities far behind the front. The refugees put an additional strain on Russia's economy. Already burdened, hardly up to the furious demands of a modern war. Russia's farms, stripped of their skilled manpower, are worked by refugees and prisoners of war. Shortage is horses. They too have been sent to the front. They too must be replaced. There is grain on the farms, but there are bread lines in the cities. Russia's crude transport system has broken down. Civilian chunk of bread, sometimes a kettle of milk. Meat is often unobtainable. The Tsar's capital, Petrograd, its name changed from the Germanic St. Petersburg, is a city whose 2 million inhabitants are freezing for lack of fuel. Away and out of touch at his army headquarters, the Tsar has told his ministers not to bother him with civilian problems. But the dominant member of the Romanov family is close at hand, his German-born Empress Alexandra, a headstrong, superstitious woman obsessed with the ill health of her son Alexis. The boy suffers from hemophilia. Servants must not let him out of their sight. A fall from his horse, the slightest bruise, may cause bleeding that could be fatal. The hysterical search for a remedy to the boy's illness has brought the royal family under the influence of a creature who belongs in a nightmare. A Siberian faith healer named Grigory Rasputin, an odorous, lecherous peasant who calls himself a monk. Rasputin lives on the royal estate, influences the appointment of generals and ministers, steers their policies. His boudoir is filled with scatterbrained countesses. His power is hypnotic and disastrous. A Russian prince, Felix Yusupov, decides to murder Rasputin as a service to his country. He is assisted by the Grand Duke Dmitri, a young cousin of the Tsar. They find their victim hard to kill. Glass after glass of wine laced with cyanide, and he is still calling for more gypsy songs. Shot at least twice, he is probably still alive when he is finally dropped into the Neva River. The assassins are popular heroes, arrested briefly, never tried. In the Duma, Russia's feeble parliament, demands are made openly for the Tsar's abdication. But the government continues to wrestle with Rasputin's corrupt influence, which is still weirdly alive. His friend, the Minister of the Interior, Alexander Protopopov, keeps giving the Empress psychic messages from the dead monk. Another Rasputin protege, Prime Minister Boris Sturmer, has just been dislodged as a pro-German traitor. Now, in early 1917, banners appear in the streets of Petrograd. Give us bread. Down with the war. No party leads these demonstrations. Even the marchers do not know the revolution has begun. On March 8, 1917, February in the Russian calendar, the streets of Petrograd fill with protests. Munitions workers go on strike. Mobs loot bake shops for bread, burn police stations. Soldiers of the Petrograd garrison, who at first fired on the crowd, now join the demand for the abdication of the Tsar and his German woman. It is revolution. Spontaneous, unorganized. For decades, Russian idealists, Democrats, socialists have dreamed and plotted for a day like this. Now that it has come, the revolution must hunt for leaders. While soldiers stand guard in the corridors, the Duma members hastily form a provisional government. Its nominal chief is an aristocrat, Prince Georgy Lvov. The leadership that has come forth is composed of political moderates. The most active member is an ambitious liberal lawyer, Alexander Kerensky. Moscow, as in Petrograd, troops of the garrison demonstrate their allegiance to the new government. At the front, which has been quiet for months, there are wild celebrations and wholesale desertions. The Tsar and his family are put under guard to prevent assassination or escape. On March 15th, 1917, Nicholas abdicates in favor of his brother Michael. At Kerensky's urging, Michael also abdicates. The Romanov dynasty has suddenly come crashing down. For political prisoners, dissenters against the Tsarist regime, the revolution means freedom. In a move that will prove as faithful as it is generous, Kerensky, as Minister of Justice, permits the left-wing underground to emerge. The radical Bolsheviks, the more moderate Mensheviks. Georgy V. Plekhanov, 60, founder of the Marxist movement in Russia. Grigory Zinoviev, returning from 9 years' exile in Switzerland. Another exile, Karl Radzic, a young veteran of the abortive revolution of 1905. Lev Kamenev, returning from Siberia to help form the Bolshevik leadership. Vyacheslav M. Scriabin, 27, known as Molotov, editor of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda. Yosef Vissarionovich Jugashvili, 38, known as Stalin, just back from Siberia. Lev Bronstein, 38, known as Trotsky, returning from his exile in the Bronx, New York. On this street in Zurich, Switzerland, the master planner has waited his chance to join the others. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, cool, brilliant, and obsessed. Russia's enemy, Germany, has been giving him money and support through go-betweens. Alexander Helfand, a German spy master, finances Lenin's propaganda for distribution in Russia. Fritz Platen, a Swiss socialist, helps arrange a German scheme to transport Lenin to Petrograd in a sealed train by way of Germany. Lenin and his companions sign a statement saying they go voluntarily. Lenin leaves for Russia in April 1917. The German government is in a hurry. The United States has just entered the war. Russia must be immobilized. Lenin reaches the Finland station in Petrograd on April 16, 1917. Makes a speech to the waiting crowd. Denounces the piratical imperialist war. Attacks the new Russian government. A telegram arrives in Berlin. Lenin is working exactly as we would wish. For the Allies with missions in Petrograd, the revolution is a dilemma. They are relieved to be rid of the corrupt Tsarist regime. They are concerned about keeping the new regime in the war. The United States offers $300 million in loans. President Wilson's special envoy, Elihu Root, a former Secretary of State, presents the terms. No fight, no loans. Still hoping to stave off defeat, Alexander Kerensky, now Minister of War, launches a new drive on the Austrian front. Again, General Brusilov directs the troops. Again, they break the Austrian lines and score an early advance. Again, German guns slow down the attack. This time, the Russian army is finished. The Germans do not even bother to take prisoners. They let them run away. In Petrograd, the news of defeat is received with joy by the Bolsheviks. Through their control of worker and soldier committees called Soviets, Lenin's followers are building a power of their own. On July 17, 1917, opposition erupts. The slogan is, "Down with the government, all power to the Soviets." But the leading Bolsheviks, including Lenin, are strangely absent when Kerensky's troops open fire. The government cracks down. Bolshevik headquarters are smashed. Lenin flees to Finland. Trotsky is arrested. Kerensky is now prime minister, but his government will soon be threatened again, this time by a coup from the right. In September, his principal general, Laver Kornilov, marches on the capital. Kerensky, taking fright, appeals for support from the left wing and provides them with arms. The coup fails when Kornilov's troops desert him. But now the Bolsheviks have arms for a military force of their own, the Red Guards. And within weeks, the Bolshevik leaders are released from jail, and Lenin comes home from Finland. With a new threat rising, Kerensky desperately calls on his dwindling forces to help defend his government. The first and last attempt at democracy in the 1,000-year history of Russia. Petrograd is on the brink of another revolution. When the revolution comes on November 7th, 1917, it is almost too easy. The city has lost its will to resist. Trained Bolshevik squads take over key installations, telegraph, post office, bank, and railway stations. Meet resistance only at the Winter Palace. The Red Guards quickly capture the government ministers, except for Kerensky, who escapes. The next day, with the city in the hands of the Bolsheviks, Lenin declares, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." As the first act of the Red Revolution, Lenin proclaims, "Russia will now make peace, immediate peace, and renounce all treaties with the Allies." Trotsky, his tireless collaborator, gets the thankless assignment of negotiating with the Germans at German-held Brest-Litovsk. Trotsky is horrified by the German demands. Russia must give up a quarter of her pre-war territory, a third of her population, half her industries, all major defenses. The Russians stall for time. Only after the German army begins a march on Petrograd is the treaty signed. The agony of the Eastern Front is over. Russia, the largest ally, is out of the war. The first of the doomed dynasties has fallen. A captive Nicholas II, once Tsar of all the Russias, poses with his family for an odd photograph, sitting on a roof, the last picture of them alive. When he abdicated, so the story goes, Nicholas put down his pen and asked an official witness, "Do you think it might have been avoided?"
Okay. Interesting last words. Those basically were the thoughts of his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who also realized this was one big mistake, but too late. Okay, are there any questions? If you have any, you can email me anytime, or we can bring up the next class on Thursday. But there was a question about the midterm. So you'll get an announcement with more details, but basically the midterm will be posted one day next week, and you'll have 2 days to submit your answers via email. The midterm will cover everything through what we did today, and it has 2 parts. The first part, you have to choose, I believe, 4 out of 6 essays, maybe it's 3 out of 5 essays. There are, general questions, not specifics. I mean, they're overall questions about major issues that came up, in the course of these first few months. The second part, you have to do identification, 5 out of 6. And in 2 or 3 sentences, these are either going to be names or dates or battles. So just briefly identify them and describe them in either 3 or 4 sentences. We'll talk a bit about how to do the essay most effectively before the exam, probably the next time. Obviously, because of the nature of the class and everything online, obviously it's open book. But that does, that in a way, it's a double-edged sword. It means that I expect a little bit more detail in your answer than normally I would expect if I were giving it to you in class. What else? If you've kept up with the lectures, which have been taped, I mean, by the way, if you want to see any of the last taped lectures, see them quickly, because I have to keep eliminating them because it takes up too much space. And then I can't post new ones. So at least the last 3, or maybe 4, they're still up there. If you want to see them before I remove them shortly. If you've kept up with the reading assignment, and if you've listened to the lecture, attended the lectures, there's nothing on the exam that hasn't been covered. I'm not out to get you. It's not a trap. It's not a, whatever. My greatest concern is that you learn the important facts of this war and, what the main issues were, and that's going to be the nature of the question. I'm not so much, interested in the nitty gritty, but the big picture, that you understand, the big issues, what led to the war, what were the different issues in the 2 battlefronts, on the Western Front, the Eastern Front, French warfare. How did weapons and armaments affect the course of the war, and so on. So, broad questions, but obviously also want, specifics in your answer. Again, if you've kept up with it and watched the lectures, if you've read the assignment, everything is there. It's really a giveaway in many ways. But again, my greatest concern is that you learn from, the important thing is learning what's important in this topic. I'm not here to undermine your GPA or make it difficult for you to do well. You should all do well, because there's really no reason you shouldn't. But just when you answer the essay, make sure that you back up your answer with facts. And we certainly have enough factual information to make your essay stand, to have it hold water. So there'll be more talking about the essay the next time, and when I post it, there'll be an announcement that goes with it, perhaps with more specific information about how to go about it, but there really should be no problem. If you have any questions, of course, email me, and I'll get back to you right away. One last time, any questions about what we did today? I mean, this whole Russian Revolution and what happened on the Eastern Front is a really, really fascinating topic and deserves more time than I have to give to it. I mean, it's really a subject in its own right. It's your whole course just in the Russian Revolution. But I just wanted to get the main thrust of it, and how that was, you know, a major outgrowth of the war. And again, as was pointed out in the documentary, Russia was the first empire to fall. It's 1917. The war is going to end in 1918, and a few more empires will be erased from the map as well. So it was really a game changer, changed the map of the world. And what we haven't talked about yet, we're getting to shortly, is the war in the Middle East. And that's a really interesting issue. We don't really think of the Middle Eastern conflict today in terms of what happened 100 years ago during World War I, but you'll see that what's going on in the Middle East and what's been going on in the Middle East is a direct outgrowth of some of the moves and some of the decisions made in World War I as well. So it really was a major event in the 20th century, and the reverberations are still with us. Anyway, if there are no questions, take care, and we'll see each other again on Thursday. And I'll speak more at that time also about the midterm. So be well and stay safe.